Hi, I'm Shannon Sand, agricultural economist and extension educator with the Center for Ag Profitability at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Thank you for joining our webinar series, which typically takes place every Thursday at this time, noon Central. Find a full schedule and an archive of past recordings on our website at cap.unl.edu. Today, we'll be focusing on the important topic of communication between generations on the farm and ranch. Each of us is a member of a generational cohort used to describe groups of similarly aged people. People from the same generation are often depicted as sharing similar traits and characteristics, leading to the development of microgenerations when individuals do not match existing generations. This workshop will work to dispel common misconceptions about generations and explore how to communicate across those generations. Joining us to present, we're very excited to have Leacey E. Brown, an Extension Gerontology Field Specialist at South Dakota State University. Leacey's professional interests includes ageism, aging in place, brain health, community development, demographics, adult technology use, universal design, and accessible design in print and web products. Leacey, thank you so much for joining us today, and I will turn it over to you now.
Thank you very much. Let me press this good old share button, make sure I have everything selected. So yes, my name is Leacey Brown, and I'm a gerontology field specialist with South Dakota State University located in Rapid City. Shannon did a good job of describing kind of the areas that I work in. But today, our learning objectives are to identify the generations and their birth years, to compare and contrast generational stereotypes, and then to discuss how to communicate across different generations. Alrighty, I want everyone to grab a piece of paper. And on your piece of paper, it needs to be a big piece of paper because you're going to have to do some brainstorming. There's going to be a lot of brainstorming in this workshop. Definitely get your chat box pulled up because there's going to be some work with the chat box. But what I want you to do, get a big piece of paper, and I want you to write these 6 generations that I have listed on the screen onto your piece of paper. Be sure to leave room under each one so you can write some stuff about each generation. But I also want you to include the birth year. So start with the birth years for each generation. So write down each generation name, write down when that generation begins and when that generation ends. So start by doing that first. I am going to give you about a minute and a half. Okay. Go ahead and brainstorm the birth year and the start year for each of the 6 generations on the screen. And if you happen to get done before the timer is up, I want you to start brainstorming the characteristics of each generation on your piece of paper. So step 1, what years encompass each generation? You have about 40 seconds left to write down your responses. And we're going to be using this paper a bit throughout the next few slides, so keep it. And like I said, after you've got the years written down for each generation, then I want you just to start writing characteristics of each generation on your paper. We got about 10 seconds left. All righty, let's get that handy dandy chat box going. And I would like to start with the greatest generation. Please type in the chat box when the greatest generation begins and when it ends. So we got 1901 to 1927, 1915 to 1930. Keep them coming. There's no wrong answers here. Keep them coming. 1902 to 1922. World War II. Okay, keep going. Anybody else? Give you another 15 seconds before we move on to the silent generation. 1909 for 1925 for greatest. Okay, let's move on to the silent generation. What are the birth years for the silent generation? Looks like we got another 1910 and 1925 for the greatest. So now we're on to the silent generation. What are the birth years? So we got 1928 to 1945, 1923 to 1946, and 1931 to 1945. Okay. 1925 to 1940. All righty. The baby boom generation, the generation that gets all the attention. What are the birth years for the baby boom generation? 46 to 64, 47 to 66, 40 to 55, 59 to 66. All right, how about Gen X, Generation X? What years were Generation X? What are the birth years for Generation X? 65 to 80, 65 to 80, 67 to 80, 65 to 80, 65 to 75. All right, next group are the millennials. What are the birth years for the millennial generation? 1981 to 96, 81 to 96, 80 to 95, 75 to 85. All right, Gen Z, 97 to 12, 96 to 2010, 95 to 2010. Okay. Thank you for kind of going through this activity for me. I can tell some of you actually do know what the generations actually are. But one of the problems with the generations, there's no good consensus on what they are. Pew Research and the Census Bureau kind of agree on who the generations are. The silent generation isn't in their chart, and I think part of it's because, the silent generation's up there. A silent generation, I think, is like 1927. I should have gotten that. I'm sorry. 1927 to probably like 1905, somewhere around there. I'd have to look. I'm sorry, I didn't pull that. But the point of the slide is you can look and see that depending on what organization you are, you may define the generations differently. And you'll notice there is no Xennial on here. There is no Generation Jones on here. Those really, if you hear those terms, they're really just marketing terms. They're not really terms that are used by anybody who is using the generations to conduct research. All right, for this next activity, I told you on your piece of paper, I want you to brainstorm. For this next portion of the activity, we're going to brainstorm the characteristics of each generation. And we listen and we don't judge. I would try not to be too derogatory if you're describing a member of the generation, but that's what we're going to be doing. At this point, we're just going to brainstorm the different characteristics of each generation, and then we're going to talk about those characteristics. So again, during this portion, we listen and we don't judge. So we're going to start with the greatest generation. Oh, forgive me, 1901 to 1927 is the greatest generation. So this generation is up there. This generation is around 100 years old right now. So I would like you can write on your paper at first, but then transfer some of your answers to the chat box. What are traits and characteristics of the greatest generation who was born between 1901 and 1927? So brainstorm some answers. Fought in World War II, okay? So World War II, yeah, depending on how old they were, because World War II ended in 45. Money savers, depression, Went through Great Depression. Yep. Other characteristics. Resilient to adversity. Okay. Any other characteristics we want to add about the greatest generation? Wait a minute. Feels like I missed a slide. I did miss a slide. I'm sorry. Experience periods of what? I'll come back to the chat. I realized I skipped this slide. I wanted to show you this slide before we talked about the brainstorming. I must have just quick fingered it. Um, So this gives you a visualization of what the age and sex characteristics of our population is. The blue is male, the orange is female, the bottom is under 5, the top is over 85. So you can see kind of how old different generations were in 2023. So you're talking about your silent generation, they would have been age 78 to 95 in 2023. The baby boom generation was age 59 to 77 in 2023. Generation X was age 43 to 58 in 2023. Millennials were 27 to 42 in 2023. And then our Gen Z, they were 11 to 26 in 2023. And then our Gen Alpha are under 10. I like this diagram because I think it gives you a sense of like what does the population actually look like by age. So I forgive me for skipping this. Like I said, I must have hit my finger too quick. So again, Patty writes that the greatest generation experienced periods of want, and I would say that's true. You think the end of the 20s was when we had the stock market crash, so a lot of the folks born in the greatest generation went through some serious trials. Okay, now the silent generation. These are folks who were born from 1928 to 1994. What are the characteristics of the silent generation? Children during the Depression and World War II. Yep. So the silent generation, they were children during the Depression and World War II. That's a good answer. They hate to waste. It's another good answer. What are some other characteristics of our silent generation? Did what they expected to do. Quiet, conservative. Reserved. Okay. Now the baby boom generation. What are the characteristic and traits of the baby boom generation, the folks born from 1946 to 1964? So high expectations of comfort. So the baby boom, they have high expectations of comfort. They're used to abundance. So what other characteristics do the baby boomers have? They do not relinquish leadership roles easily. No one else can do it as well as they can. Lots of them, so they need to be competitive to succeed. Spenders, financial stability. Come on, some other thoughts about our baby boom generation? Wars would the baby boom generation have been involved with? Caught in a great transition, confused, verbal on events, generally conservative. Vietnam, Korean Wars. Okay. Let's move on to Gen X. Civil rights. Good ad right there, Sean. Shauna, hard. Okay, now Gen X, those folks born from 1965 to 1980. Hardworking. I see that, Shauna. What do we have to say about Gen X? What are the characteristics of Generation X? Latchkey kids. Were they exposed to growing like what did the Gen X generation see in news? Sandwich generation between parents and kids, more awareness of social issues, independent bin rules. Okay, these are some good descriptions. Um, Shrinking world through TV. In the shadow of boomers, tough to move up the corporate ladder. There's any more thoughts coming through? So more single blended parent families, move from no TV to TV, no technology but aren't addicted. Fall of the Berlin Wall, good example, Marcia. They want work-life balance. Okay. Now we're going to move to the millennials. So Gen X is loyal to the career. All right, millennials, Gen Y. What are the characteristics of millennials? These are the folks born from 1981 to 1996. What are the characteristics of millennials? Entitled. Millennials are entitled. Grow up with PCs. Interest in self-care. Feel expected to go to college, get a degree. Okay. Social media completely changed communication style. Yeah. Any other comments about our millennials? Under higher pressure to conform. Internet, less access to housing, saw the housing crash coming. All right, Gen Z, rapid tech changes. Gen Z is next. Freedom and comfortable life. So let's brainstorm some characteristics of Gen Z. What's Gen Z like? Gen Z is the tech generation. Gen Z, less married people in Gen Y and Gen Z. Other characteristics of Gen Z, social media involvement. They feel financially left behind. Lack confidence in the workplace. Do not see value in previous less tech generations. Received awards for participation. So now my last question. Often don't conform to traditional religion. Okay. All right. So each one of us is a member of a generation. And, we've been describing the different characteristics of different generations in the chat box. And now the question I have for you. So our colleagues here in the workshop today have described characteristics of your generation. And I'm curious, do the qualities the group identified for your generation reflect your own experiences? Why or why not? So, as a member of a generation that was described by our colleagues in chat, do you identify with the characteristics and traits that our colleagues said about your generation? Dale says yes. Shannon says no. Becky says some of them. Connor says Gen Z here, more or less, a few disagreements. Somewhat, I'm a cusper, so I see both generations. Some of them, millennial for the most part. I'm a Patty, I'm a Gen X, and some descriptions fit, others do not. I'll give others a few more minutes to type in case they just need a little bit more time to type their response. Shauna says some. The truth is, your answers align with exactly what I would expect. Some of the traits, yeah, that you relate to them. Some of the traits, no. Generations really, they're not a scientific tool. How we decide when one generation ends and one generation begins is arbitrary. We have no meaningful way that we assign people to generations. Somebody in here started about talking about being a cusper. I'm a 1981 millennial. Most people who meet me describe me as having characteristics of what they would say as a Gen X, but I'm definitely a 1981 millennial. Generations are biased towards Western cultures. They may not reflect generations in other parts of the world. Generations do not account for the influence of external factors. So that picture I have on the screen, what is that? Who knows what that is? Type it in chat. What is it? What kind of floppy, though? It's not just a floppy. What kind? There's multiple types of floppy. 5.5. It's a 5.5 floppy disk. That's going way back in the brain. Okay, so for those of you who knew who knew what that was, I would guess most of you are not a Gen Z. Are you Gen Z? If you knew what this was, are you Gen Z? Anybody else? We got a note from Samantha. We got a Sean. Are you a Gen Z, Sean? Are you? Okay. So the reason why I point this out, this is a 5.5 floppy. This technology came out in the early 80s, I believe. And my colleague who just started this year is a 2000 Gen Z. He remembers using these in high school. So you got to think a 24-year-old remembers using, but yeah, you're Gen X. It makes sense that you would remember using those floppies. But think about a 24-year-old Gen Z who grew up in rural South Dakota where they didn't have the funds to update to the latest and greatest technology every time something advanced. They used these 5.5 floppies up until this young man was in high school, which would have been less than 8 years ago. So the problem with generations is they do not account for those external factors that affect who we are and who we become as individuals. This young man also writes in cursive. You don't think of a 24-year-old young man being able to write in cursive, yet he does, and he's a Gen Z. The generations, they exaggerate the intergenerational divide. They lead us to believe that we as members of different generations are in conflict with people from other generations. People change over time. Generations tend to focus on who people are in their youth. And the simple fact is, the older we get, the more diverse we become from our peers. When we're all 18, we're pretty similar across the board. We've had the same life experiences for the most part. But as we get older and we make different choices and we take different paths in our lives, we become more different. We do not become more similar as we get older. Um, it generations promote overgeneralization that lead to stereotypes and oversimplification. Um, there was trophy generation. There was comments about the trophy generation in there. There's comments about the entitled generation in there. Those are oversimplifications. These stereotypes about generations also skew towards the experiences of upper middle class people. People who are of a lower income, they don't have the same experiences. And there's also just a lack of longitudinal data that truly allows us to compare different generations. So, you know, we have to ask members of a generation the same question when they were at different life stages. So, if we want to know about their child rearing habits, we have to ask all members of Gen X a question about, having children when they're, say, 25. That's just a number. But we also have to ask boomers when they're around 25, and millennials around when they're 25, and Gen Z around when they're 25. And the questions have to be the same. And the research methods have to be the same. And what I'm telling you is that data is simply not there. It's not available. But I do have an example of that data on this screen to show you what I'm talking about. Someone made a comment about Gen Z and millennials. Where is it? Not having children or something, less married. Gen Y and Gen Z are less married. I don't know that we can say too much about Gen Z right now, because Gen Z is technically still there's still some of the Gen Z people are teenagers still. So, but this graph on the screen shows you a compilation of census data from the 1960s of 4 generations. Kind of a question was asked of each generation when they were 23 to 38 years old. So in 1968, when Silent Generation was 23 to 38 years old, 70% of them were living with a spouse and a child. Fast forward to 1987, when the boomers are age 23 to 38, 46% are living with a spouse and child. Then Gen X in 2003, when they were age 23 to 38, 40% of them were living with a spouse and a child. And then you get to my generation, the millennials, in 2019, when we were 23 to 38, 30% of us were living with a spouse and child. This is a data set that allows you to see differences by generation because we have the data point from when each generation was 23 to 38 years old. Any comments or questions about this graph? I want to talk about how to use generations effectively. And I just pulled this quote from Michael Dimick in the Pew Research Center because I thought it described it better. So I'm just going to read you this quote. The eras in which we came of age can leave a signature of common experiences and perspectives. Events such as terrorist attacks, wars, recessions, and pandemics can shape the opportunities and mindsets of those most affected by them. Similarly, historical advances like desegregation, effective birth control, the invention of the internet, and the arrival of artificial intelligence can fundamentally change how people live their lives, and the youngest generations are often on the vanguard. At the same time, some events can affect people across all generations, moving everyone in one direction or another. It is wise to think of terms like Gen X, millennial, Gen Z, and baby boomer as general reference points instead of scientific facts about another person. It pays off to interact with with people as unique individuals rather than just members of a generation or some other like-minded group. So that is the key thing I really want you to take from all this teasing apart of generations that we have done today. Try to avoid thinking of people as just members of a generation with similar traits. We are all individuals. We all have different life experiences that truly do shape how we interact with the world around us. He writes, I can better understand better concern. I can understand better concerns of population changes. Patty, are you talking about that Pew Research graphic that I showed you? I'm going to go ahead. Yeah. I mean, I'm going to go back to that graph. Change is scary. And that's what I'm going to say to you. Change is scary. And our society is changing, and it has changed. Once upon a time, the trajectory of life was pretty universal. I mean, everybody got married, everybody had kids, and that was kind of, you know, um, a normal expectation, but things have different changed. Technology has changed, and there could be growing pains, but I would urge you, don't feed into the concerns that people try to tell you about population collapse or anything. I don't think our population is going anywhere. The world population is still growing. The world population is not shrinking. So there is no real concern about population collapse. AI Gen starting in 2015. I have to look at that graph again there, Dale. Okay, let's talk about how to communicate across the generations, because I have a lot on this slide. I put technology number one on this list because there is a lot of stereotypes that younger people are more tech savvy than older people. That is a stereotype. The variable that really tells you more about whether or not somebody you're trying to reach is using technology is their income level. That's going to tell you so much more than their age, than their rurality. Their income level is going to tell you so much more. Younger people really are familiar with the technology that they use. So if they're only using a smartphone from, 6 years old till college, they're only going to be good at the smartphone. Those smartphone skills do not translate to using a personal computer. So I would encourage you, when you're thinking about technology, divorce yourself of the assumption that certain age groups don't use technology. Certain age groups use it less, but as the boomers get older, they are using it more. And if you think about the boomers, so the boomers were born, 1964 or 1946 to 1964. The internet was pretty popular, 94-ish. So the oldest of the boomers would have been in their mid 40s when they started using the internet. So we've got to get away from this assumption that people aren't using the internet. First, ask yourself, what's their income level? Ask them. I think that's a really good way, because some people like text messages, some people like emails, some people like written things. It's best to ask people what type of technology they like to use for communication. This is one that I imagine you have heard quite a bit. You statements versus I statements. So if you're trying to communicate with somebody, we might be tempted to say, when you leave the garbage out, you make my life harder. We have to learn how to describe how we're affected without using you. You is a very aggressive word. It's a very confrontational word. It's accusational. So you might instead say, I feel like my time doesn't matter when I have to come home and take out the garbage. I feel like my time doesn't matter when I have to grab the laundry and put it in the basket. When the dishes aren't clean, I feel like I don't matter or whatever. Silent generation. See, that's Dale. See, when we say, oh, this generation doesn't like PCs, I don't know that we can say that universally about any generation, Dale. That's my point. I don't think we can universally say, okay, this generation doesn't like PCs. I was on a call with an 86-year-old yesterday who was using her PC to talk to me. So we can't make those assumptions. Oh, silent generation hates PCs. That's an assumption that we're making. You're best to ask them. So again, I statements really focus on how you're affected. If you're dealing with a farm, I'm concerned what's going to happen to the farm in the future. My dad's a 76-year-old boomer and plays pilot video games. So it really varies by person. And he's been playing video games for decades. Um, so how to talk to relatives about sensitive topics. Be proactive. If you are seeing something that is concerning, your loved one is using farm equipment and they're making mistakes that could be fatal. Be proactive. Don't wait for something to happen. Do your homework. If you're starting to notice problems with driving, problems with paying bills, you got to start keeping a journal. You got to start writing this stuff down so that when you are trying to talk about it, you have examples of what's going on that's concerning. Choose the right time and place. I mean, it depends on the conversation. It depends on who needs to be involved. You really want to make sure people aren't tired when you're trying to have these conversations. Depending on, you might choose the holidays. A lot of people don't like to think of having, sensitive conversations around the holidays, but depending on the nature of the conversation, you may want people in person to talk about it. Be honest and clear. If there's serious things that are happening, you have to be honest and clear about what you see that's going to happen. Show empathy and compassion. When we're talking about sensitive issues, it could be health related, it could be death and dying related, it could be, family business related, so try to be empathetic and compassionate about what folks are going for, especially when we're talking about, you know, these sensitive topics that can be really difficult to talk about. Involve professionals. There's just going to be situations, especially when you're dealing with like my wheelhouse, elder law, end of life, estate planning. You're going to have to involve professionals. I do not recommend downloading forms or anything like that. You need to work with a professional. Follow up. These types of talks rarely are done once. It takes multiple conversations, and it's going to take some following up. You're going to have to follow up with people and make sure things get followed through. My perhaps number one tip is get your own house in order. So if you are worried about your parents not having a financial or a medical power of attorney, if you don't have those documents for yourself, to me, I don't think you're in a good place to try to encourage somebody else to get their legal and financial documents in order. So get your own house. As a gerontologist, I talk a lot about communicating about advancing age. I could probably do a small survey in this room, and I'm willing to bet that, very few of you would say, yeah, I'm looking forward to getting older. Getting older is something that most people fear. Getting older is something that most people deny. I've met people who are holding at 29, and it's clear they're 80. So it can be difficult to talk about aging because of the aversion we have to aging and decline. So I'm going to give you a couple tips from my space. There is this whole piece of labeling. In general, senior citizen, senior, the elderly, seasoned, young lady, those are not terms that we recommend using when you're trying to refer to somebody who is age 60 or 65 and older. Those are terms that typically bring to mind stereotypes about people who are incompetent and need help. And unfortunately, if you're trying to talk about advancing age, you don't want to make your loved one feel like you think they're incompetent. So my recommendation, what they're telling us is use older adult, older farmer, older volunteer. That word older is a gradable term. At all points in life, we are either older or younger than somebody. So that's the recommendation for the label. Othering. we often tend to speak about aging as if it's happening to somebody else entirely. The truth is, each and every one of you who is in this call, you are now older than you were when you started this call with me 42 minutes ago. Aging does not start at 65. We begin aging mid-20s. We start aging. So we need to talk about aging as if it's happening to ourselves. So you might say, sometimes as we get older, we need help doing the snow removal. Just remembering that this is an experience that we're all going to go through. We're all going to go through decline. We're all going to go through death and dying. This is not something that happens to some other group. And the more that we think about this as an inclusive thing that we also need to plan for, the better our outcomes are. There's something called elder speak. Elder speak is a way of talking to an older person like they are incompetent. You might say, like, honey, you want to take your medicine, don't you? Oh, sweetie, you're so cute today. It's this demeaning and childlike way of talking to an older person. And what we know from the research is if you speak to an older person like that, particularly with dementia, they will behave poorly. They will begin to act out because they can sense that you think they're not very smart. The last one I want to talk about is crisis versus creativity and innovation. Don't come at your loved ones like, if you don't do anything, we're going to lose the farm. No. How can we be creative? How can we be innovative to make the farm last into the future? So try to avoid describing stuff about advancing age as a crisis. Instead, how can we be creative? How can we come up with innovative solutions for our farms and our ranches that keep them strong, sustainable businesses? The last part that I want to talk to is how do parents talk to kids on and off the farm? I think most important is you have to discuss the goals and priorities for the business. The business is what's at stake here. So you have to talk about what are the goals and priorities for this business, which may mean, one child gets completely cut out because anything you do to separate and maybe make things equal would ruin the business because you would have to sell it down. Discuss the roles and responsibilities. I mean, who is going to be involved in keeping this family business going? Be honest about the resources you need for the goals. If you're not able to get life insurance or whatever, so your off-farm kids can get something when you pass away, you got to be honest that that's not available. And then finally, be transparent and honest. Sometimes businesses end up with large operating notes, and it can be shameful. It feels shameful to have that, but you have to be realistic and say, hey, we have this operating note that has to be taken care of in the event that something happens with me, but making sure folks are clear about that. Okay, so any comments about this screen? Or these tips or any experiences? We've got 15 minutes. Any experiences trying to communicate across the generations? Thanks, Marcia. I'll just wait another minute, see if anyone's typing their thoughts still. See, Dale. So a younger generation has an exaggerated sense of entitlement. So this is a young person in your family that has an exaggerated sense of entitlement. So these are members of your family, not necessarily the whole generation. I mean, that's one thing I'm trying to do here is to stop describing younger people as one generation or older people as one generation with all these similar characteristics. Because it's going to vary. Yes, that's it. Thank you, Patty. That's an important one. That elder speak. I mean, it is Very problematic. And it sounds like baby talk. And if you are ever in a situation and you see someone talking baby talk to your loved one, correct them. Don't let them do that. And that's just it. Nobody wants to be talked down to. And that's what elder speak does. You're talking down to them. You're talking to them like they're dumb, essentially. Yep. But I have watched the elder speak within situations and how the conversation peak. Definitely. So these are just some tips. I mean, I think you could do a whole workshop for half a day just practicing how to communicate. But the thing I want you to remember is every person is a unique individual. Try to avoid assuming they are one way or another because they're a member of a generation. Jerry, that's good news. Congratulations. Absolutely, Patty. Some of the I have met some amazing older folks who are super energetic, super engaged, and I'm like, oh, I want to be like that. That's my goal and my aspiration. Marcia, you hit kind of a really interesting dynamic. With people living so much longer, sometimes when you're looking at transitioning operations, it can be complicated because I've heard of situations where, somebody, a producer will be 80, 90 years old. The adult son is 60, 70 years old. Then their children, 40 years old. And what ends up happening is it doesn't make sense to transition to the 60-year-old that they just transition to the 40-year-old. So it can be really complicated when the operators who control the whole operation aren't willing to start that transition process. So the summary of this presentation, I ran those words together. Generations are difficult to measure and scientifically study. There is no definitive way to say, oh, this is when Gen X begins, this is when Gen Y begins. As we saw from our activity earlier, everybody wrote different years. A few of you got them right, but everybody wrote different years. What they can do is they can give you a sense of, oh, hey, Leacey was born in 1981. She probably had Apple computers around her most of her school career. Did she use them? No, because computers didn't get cool to me until I could get online in the 90s. So we just have to remember they can help us understand what they might have been exposed to. But as I shared about my colleague who's 24 and can write in cursive and knows what a 5.5 floppy in, where you grow up makes a huge difference. I grew up in Florida in the 80s. I was online by the time I was 14. I would wager somebody in South Dakota who was born in 1981 did not get on the internet as early as I did. So that generations are not a hard science. They're more of a marketing gimmick. There are pitfalls to thinking of people in terms of generation, and they're well documented. It promotes stereotyping. It promotes oversimplification. It exaggerates the differences between the generations. Communications across the generations begins with seeing person as an individual and not some member of a monolithic group. And the key thing is many families struggle to communicate about sensitive topics. Start now. Do not expect these conversations to move quickly, especially when you're dealing with difficult topics like illness, dying, or transitioning a business. So let me see what he says. Becky writes, I think it's hard for the first group to let go of farming. They feel like they're giving up their identity. Becky, and that's a really good comment that you made, because I think when we're thinking about frailty, decline, end of life, that independence and control can truly be one of the most difficult things that we have to let go of. And some people simply are not able to do that. They're not able to let go. So I have arrived kind of to the question and answer time. So if you want to type your questions in chat box, comments, oops. If you don't have any questions, was there one thing you learned today that surprised you from this talk? Was there one thing that you learned during our talk today that surprised you? We've got 8 minutes left, so. I do not recommend do it yourself for legal. I do not. The income level in the text, thanks, Kendall. That's super important. You can look at the data. So you're best to like really ask people, do they like text message? Do they like email? Do they like printed? You're really best to ask and not assume technology skills. I'm working on a workplace study and this fits with my research. Awesome, Marcia. I'm glad it can be helpful. I do have a few resources. Oh, there's my contact info. I'll let you leave this for a second. And legal planning is super complicated. I'm just going to touch a little bit more on what, Patty Martinson said. Legal planning is super complicated. It's best to talk to an attorney about your situation and to make sure that you have your ducks in a row. If you own property, you're typically going to go through probate. There may be some things you can talk to an attorney about, but you're typically going to go through probate if you have property.
I'll just also add in find an attorney you're comfortable with because they have to know everything.
Everything. Yeah, that's a good point. Everything. Your nitty gritty dark secrets that you don't want no one to know, they kind of got to know. So hopefully you can just realize when you see these generational videos that it's just comedy. When you see the stuff online, talk about generations, it's just comedy for the most part. I mean, yeah, there's organizations out there claiming to do generational research, but as I shared earlier, there's not a lot of data that follows different cohorts of people over time. Like I said, you've got to ask every generation when they're 25 a question, and it's got to be the same question. So don't get too hung up on one generation being a certain way or another. Well, I don't see any questions, so maybe people want their 5 minutes back. Thanks, Shauna. It's good to have everybody here. Hope it gave you something to work with.
All right. I don't see any other questions. Do you, Leacey?
No,
Okay.
nobody's.
All right. So thank you for joining us today, everybody, and Leacey. It's like when you close out your Zoom window, please take a brief moment to complete the evaluation that appears, as it really helps us to understand how we did and inform us for future webinars. Thank you and have a great afternoon.
I'm going to respond to one question from Kelly.
Oh, you got a question?
Kelly,
Okay.
we will send you the slideshow. You will get all of my slides emailed to you. So, Becky, you should be able to print my slides once you get them.
Yeah, and those will go out. Leacey, if I can get those from you, we'll make sure they're sent out in the next 24 hours or so when the recording is posted.
Okay.
Shannon, did you send those over to Ryan?
Oh, yep, you're
Probably
right.
not.
Yeah, because I sent them to Shannon, so.
I thought I did, but I can't guarantee.
Perfect. Yep. So next 24 hours, look for those in your inbox, everybody.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.